A black Navy SEAL walks through the city, unaware that a confrontation is just moments away. A racist cop spots him and decides to make trouble, thinking his badge gives him all the power. But this time, he picked the wrong man. Marcus isn't just any ordinary citizen. He's trained, disciplined, and refuses to be disrespected. As tension rises, the officer pushes too far, expecting fear. Instead, he gets a response that shakes him to his core. What happens next is something he never saw coming. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new one. It was a bright and clear afternoon when a black Navy SEAL, Marcus, was walking down the street after a long day of training. Dressed casually in a t-shirt and jeans, he was just trying to enjoy the rare moments of peace that came with being off duty. Little did he know his day was about to take an unexpected turn. As Marcus walked past a local convenience store, a cop, Officer Davis, who was standing near the entrance, locked eyes with him. From the start, there was something about the officer's look that made Marcus feel uneasy, but he brushed it off. He had dealt with prejudice before and learned to rise above it. However, Officer Davis was clearly itching for a confrontation. "Hey, you!" Officer Davis called out, his voice rough and demanding. Marcus didn't stop, assuming the officer might be talking to someone else, but Davis wasn't having it. "Yeah, you, what are you doing here, huh? Shouldn't you be somewhere else?" The officer stepped toward him, blocking his path. Marcus felt the blood in his veins begin to heat up. He knew exactly what this was, an unwarranted confrontation. But he had learned to stay calm in situations like this. Still, his mind raced. It wasn't just any random cop, it was someone trying to assert power over him based on nothing more than his skin color. "I'm just walking," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "I don't want any trouble." But Officer Davis wasn't ready to let it go. He took another step forward, putting himself directly in Marcus's space. "You look suspicious. I'm asking the questions here. Don't move." Marcus stopped, his mind now calculating. The officer was way out of line. He had been trained for high-pressure situations in combat, but this was something else, something personal. He could feel his pulse quicken as memories of the injustice he had faced throughout his life flashed before his eyes. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Marcus said, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't about to let this officer intimidate him. Officer Davis didn't listen. Instead, he reached for his radio, still glaring at Marcus. "I'm going to need backup. We got one here who thinks he's above the law." That was the moment when Marcus decided he had enough. He wasn't just going to stand there and let this man ruin his day, ruin his peace, ruin his dignity. He stood tall, shoulders squared, as if he was back in Navy SEAL training. In one smooth motion, he reached into his bag, pulled out his ID, and flashed it at the officer. "I'm a Navy SEAL," Marcus said, his voice calm, but with a powerful edge to it. "And you're making a mistake." Officer Davis froze. He hadn't expected this, not in the least. His face reddened as the realization dawned on him. This wasn't some random person he could harass. Marcus could see the officer's demeanor shift, his arrogance cracking as he quickly checked Marcus's ID. For a moment, the two stood in silence. The power dynamic had shifted, and Marcus, despite all the years of facing prejudice, had the upper hand now. Officer Davis stammered out something that sounded like an apology, but Marcus wasn't interested in hearing it. "You've got a lot to learn, officer," Marcus said, his tone firm but not angry. "You might wear a badge, but respect is earned, not given. Remember that." With that, Marcus turned and walked away. His steps were strong and deliberate. He wasn't just leaving the scene, he was walking away with something much more valuable than the officer's apology, his sense of dignity, his peace, and the realization that he didn't have to let anyone define him, especially not because of his race. As Marcus walked off, Officer Davis stood there, staring after him, a lesson in humility slowly sinking in. It had been a long time since someone had taught him such a valuable lesson, and this time it wasn't the other way around. As Marcus made his way down the street, the adrenaline that had surged through him slowly started to fade. His heartbeat, once rapid with the tension of the encounter, began to slow down. He didn't look back, but the image of Officer Davis standing frozen, humbled by the truth, stayed in his mind. He had dealt with prejudice countless times in his life, but this situation felt different. It wasn't just about being judged because of his skin color. It was about a power struggle, a struggle that he wasn't going to lose, no matter who it was or where he was. He had earned his position, his respect, and his place in the world through years of hard work, sacrifice, and training. And today, he had reminded a cop who thought he could bully others that no one could take that from him. Marcus continued walking, his posture upright, shoulders squared, as if he was still on duty. He thought about the experiences that had shaped him, the SEAL training, the trials, the hardships. They had all taught him how to stay calm, how to stay in control, no matter the situation. But today he had taught someone else a lesson, one that wasn't in any manual. As he rounded the corner, he could see a few people sitting on the benches at the park nearby, chatting and enjoying the sun. One of them, an older woman, looked at him with a smile. There was something about the way she smiled, a sense of knowing, as if she had seen what had just happened between him and the officer. "You okay, son?" she asked, her voice warm but with an edge of concern. Marcus smiled back, nodding. "Yeah, just another day." The woman chuckled, a knowing glint in her eye. "You handled yourself well. Some people don't know how to treat others." "Most don't," Marcus replied. He didn't elaborate, but the woman didn't need any more explanation. She had seen it all too, and probably dealt with her fair share of discrimination in her time. "Good to see someone standing up for themselves," she said, as he walked past. "We could use more of that." Marcus nodded again, appreciating the small moment of connection. He wasn't looking for recognition or praise, but sometimes just knowing that someone saw and understood was enough. Later that night, as Marcus sat in his apartment, reflecting on the events of the day, he couldn't help but think about the officer. The humiliation he must have felt in that moment was a lesson he would carry for a long time. Maybe it would change him, maybe it wouldn't. But Marcus knew one thing for sure. He wasn't the kind of person who would let something like that slide without standing up for himself. As the night grew quieter, Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring out of the window, looking up at the stars. He thought about his journey, how far he had come, and how much further he still had to go. But one thing was certain. He would never stop fighting for his right to be treated with respect, no matter who it was or what their title was. The lesson had been learned today, and it was one that would stick with him for a long time. Sometimes standing up for yourself is more than just about you. It's about showing others that no one should be allowed to trample on your dignity, no matter their position or their power. And in that moment, Marcus knew he had made a difference. Not just for himself, but for anyone who would walk in his shoes. The following day, news of the incident spread, though not in the way one might expect. It wasn't on the front pages of any major newspapers, but in the local community, the word quickly got around. Some had seen the interaction firsthand, others had heard the story from friends or neighbors. And while there were mixed reactions, some questioned Marcus's actions, others praised him for standing his ground. One thing was certain: it made people think. In the days that followed, Marcus couldn't help but notice the shift in how some people looked at him. It wasn't just that he had confronted a police officer, but that he had done so with the kind of quiet strength and resolve that left a lasting impression. He was no longer just another face in the crowd. He had become a symbol of standing up for what's right, regardless of the situation or the power dynamics at play. As the weekend approached, Marcus found himself at a local coffee shop, grabbing a cup of coffee before heading out for a run. The barista, a young woman with a piercing gaze, handed him his drink with a smile. But there was something different in her eyes this time. "I saw what happened the other day," she said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "I just wanted to thank you." Marcus blinked, slightly surprised. "For what?" "For not backing down," she said, her tone steady. "A lot of people, when faced with someone like that officer, they just keep their head down and walk away, but you didn't. You stood your ground. That takes a lot of courage." Marcus smiled, appreciating the compliment, but not fully sure what to say. "I wasn't thinking about courage. I was just doing what needed to be done." She nodded, as though she understood exactly what he meant. "Still, it matters. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people like that officer trying to push others around. It's not always easy to stand up to them, but you did." He thanked her before heading out the door. As he walked, the conversation played over in his mind. He hadn't realized how much his actions had resonated with others. It wasn't just about confronting a cop or proving a point. It was about showing people that it was okay to stand up for yourself, to demand respect, no matter what. It was about showing that no one had the right to make you feel small or inferior. The next day, Marcus got a call from his commanding officer. He had been summoned to a meeting with someone from the police department. At first, his heart sank, thinking the situation was far from over. But as he walked into the meeting room, he was taken aback. Standing there was Officer Davis, looking much more subdued than the last time they had met. He wasn't in uniform this time, but his posture was stiff. The atmosphere was tense, but Marcus couldn't help but notice the slight change in Davis's demeanor. The arrogance that had been so obvious before was gone. In its place was something else, perhaps regret, perhaps shame. "I wanted to apologize," Officer Davis said, his voice a bit softer than Marcus had expected. "I didn't handle the situation the way I should have. I was wrong." Marcus was silent for a moment, considering the officer's words. This was not an apology Marcus had expected to receive. He had assumed that after the incident, the officer would double down, try to save face, or even ignore the situation altogether. But this was different. "Thank you," Marcus said finally, his tone calm. "I appreciate that. It's not about winning or losing. It's about respecting one another." Officer Davis nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in Marcus's words. "I can see that now, and I realize I have a lot to learn." The meeting didn't last long after that, but it had a profound impact on Marcus. He wasn't seeking an apology, he wasn't seeking to change the officer. But in that room, in that brief exchange, he realized that change was possible. People could learn, people could grow. And sometimes the lesson came in the most unexpected forms. As he left the building, Marcus felt a sense of closure. It wasn't just about the encounter anymore, it was about the ripple effect it had created. It was about standing up and showing people, officers, strangers, friends, that dignity and respect could never be taken away, not even in the face of authority. And as Marcus walked through the city streets, his heart lighter than it had been in days, he realized something else. No matter where life took him, no matter what challenges came his way, he would never back down. He had taught that lesson to the officer, to the people who had witnessed it, and most importantly, to himself. He was a Navy SEAL, but he was also something else, someone who believed in the power of standing up, in the importance of respect, and in the strength of not letting anyone take that away. A few weeks passed, and life seemed to return to its usual rhythm for Marcus. The day-to-day hustle of being a Navy SEAL, training and living his life continued, but something had shifted within him. The incident with Officer Davis had left an imprint, not just on the officer, but on Marcus too. He found himself reflecting on the power of small moments, the ones where you make a choice to rise above, to not let the world dictate how you should be treated. One afternoon, as he was jogging through the park, he ran into a familiar face. It was the woman from the coffee shop, the one who had thanked him. She was sitting on a bench reading a book when she looked up and saw him coming. "Hey, you!" she called out, waving him over. Marcus smiled and slowed his pace, jogging up to the bench and sitting beside her. "Hey, how have you been?" "Good," she replied, marking her place in the book before setting it aside. "I've been meaning to thank you again. I've been thinking about what you did, standing up to that officer. It's not something a lot of people would have had the guts to do." Marcus shrugged, feeling a little self-conscious. "I just did what needed to be done. It wasn't about guts. It was about not letting someone disrespect me." She nodded, looking thoughtful. "I get that. But you know, it's not just about that one situation. What you did made me think about how we let people walk all over us sometimes. We get scared, or we think we don't have the right to say something. You showed me that we do." Marcus listened to her, genuinely moved by her words. He had never really thought about how his actions might impact others in this way. To him, it was just a matter of standing up for himself in the face of injustice, but to her, and to others who had witnessed it, it was a reminder that standing up was something everyone had the power to do. "You're right," he said, his voice a little quieter. "A lot of times people are afraid to speak up, even when they know something's wrong. But we all have a voice. We have the right to use it." She smiled. "I've started speaking up more, even in small things. It's not always easy, but it's making a difference. I've been telling my friends about you, about that day." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I didn't know I was making that kind of impact." "Believe me," she said, laughing softly. "You are." They talked for a little while longer, exchanging stories and insights about how sometimes the smallest actions could ripple out and affect people in ways they might never even realize. It wasn't about grand gestures or making headlines. It was about showing up, being true to who you are, and letting your actions speak for themselves. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the park, Marcus stood up and stretched, ready to continue his run. "I've got to get going," he said, giving her a nod. "It was good talking to you." "Same here," she said with a smile. "Keep doing what you're doing. You've inspired more people than you know." Marcus gave her a brief wave as he began to jog away, his steps light but purposeful. The conversation had stuck with him. It wasn't just about being a Navy SEAL, about facing dangerous missions or proving himself in the field. It was about living with integrity, treating others with respect, and knowing when to stand firm in the face of adversity. That was the real mission, the one he carried with him every day, even when the uniform was left behind. Later that night, as Marcus sat at home, reflecting on everything that had happened, he found himself thinking about Officer Davis again. The officer had changed, but so had he. The world wasn't perfect, and people still had biases, still acted out of fear or ignorance, but Marcus now knew more than ever that standing up for what was right wasn't just an act of courage, it was an act of responsibility. He had reminded people that respect, fairness, and humanity weren't negotiable. And while he had learned those lessons the hard way, he was now passing them on, in whatever ways he could, whether it was through a single confrontation or an unexpected conversation on a park bench. As he leaned back in his chair, a feeling of peace washed over him. He wasn't just a soldier. He was someone who understood the importance of self-respect, the power of using his voice, and the value of teaching others to do the same. Tomorrow, he would wake up and do it all again. He didn't know where life would take him next, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never stop standing up, never stop speaking out, and never stop showing others that they too had the power to change the world, one moment at a time. As time passed, Marcus began to notice subtle changes in the way people interacted with him. It wasn't just the people in the coffee shop or the park. It was everyone. The tension from the encounter with Officer Davis seemed to have sparked a wider conversation, one that stretched beyond the initial incident. One evening, as Marcus was finishing a run, he passed by a group of young men sitting on the steps outside a local store. They greeted him as he ran by, and he offered a nod in return. As he approached, one of them stood up, a little hesitant. "Hey, man," the young guy called out. "We saw what happened that day with the cop. That was something." Marcus slowed down, stopping in front of them. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the sincerity in the young man's voice made him listen. "I just wanted to say thanks," the guy continued, his friends nodding in agreement. "I've had situations like that before, and I've always just kept quiet. But watching you stand up, it made me think, maybe I can stand up too next time." Marcus took a deep breath, processing the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was about a much larger issue, one that resonated with people from all walks of life. "You don't have to let anyone treat you like that," Marcus said, his voice firm yet understanding. "We all deserve respect, man. If we don't stand up for ourselves, who will?" The young guy smiled, clearly inspired. "Yeah, man, you're right. Thanks for showing us that. We'll remember that." Marcus gave a quick nod, then continued on his run, his chest swelling with a quiet pride. He had never imagined his actions that day would spark anything like this. But hearing those words from someone who had been in the same situation, someone who now felt empowered to stand up for themselves, made everything worth it. It wasn't long after that when Marcus received an unexpected call. It was Officer Davis. "I just wanted to check in," the officer said. His voice was less stiff than before, the weight of his earlier apology still hanging in the air. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, and I've started taking a different approach with people. I've had to work on myself, and I just wanted to thank you. You didn't just teach me a lesson that day, you opened my eyes." Marcus was taken aback. He hadn't expected any further contact from Davis, but hearing the officer speak with such humility was a pleasant surprise. "I'm glad to hear that," Marcus replied. "It's all about respect, man. We all have a responsibility to treat others with dignity, no matter who they are." There was a long pause on the line before Officer Davis spoke again. "You were right, and I've been trying to do better. I don't want to be the person I was that day." Marcus felt a sense of closure wash over him. He hadn't set out to change anyone's life, but it seemed his actions had done just that, perhaps more than he realized. The story of that day, the confrontation with the officer, his calm response, and the respect he demanded, had rippled through the community, sparking small but significant changes. People were starting to speak up. People were beginning to stand up for themselves and each other. As Marcus hung up the phone, he realized that sometimes the hardest moments in life had the power to shape not only the person who faced them, but the people around them. The lesson wasn't just about standing up in the face of adversity. It was about showing others that they too had the power to do the same. And so as Marcus walked through the streets of his city once again, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced something difficult, something unfair, but by holding on to his dignity and standing firm, he had become part of a larger movement, one that transcended race, power, or position. He wasn't just a Navy SEAL anymore. He was someone who had shown others that true strength came from standing up for what was right, no matter the consequences. That day, when Officer Davis had tried to harass him, Marcus had taught the officer a lesson. But in doing so, he had taught the world, and that was a lesson that would last a lifetime.